In this video, we're going to take a look at how feminist theory within philosophy has influenced environmental ethics. And we're going to pay particular attention to feminist ethics. So to start off, let's get acquainted with feminist ethics and their contribution to philosophy in the field of ethics. So gender inequality and sexism is well documented in history, and it remains today. A marker of gender inequality it's how women and men are portrayed in media. So I think it would help to get a sense of this by looking at how men and women have been portrayed within advertising, since advertising sort of tracks what is considered the norm within any society. So I'm going to go ahead and show a number of advertisements throughout American history and see if you can sort of pick up on some of the patterns and themes of how women are portrayed within these advertisements. So you can see there's a wide range here, a wide range throughout history. Some of these are a bit shocking, quite shocking today. And this one, as you can see, is a more recent advertisement. So one thing I think you can see from these advertisements is that women are generally portrayed as subservient to men and as sex objects. And so this sort of illustrates the oppression of women throughout American history up to even today. Now, generally there are sort of four central claims of feminist ethics. So the first claim is that women are the moral equals of men, and that practices that subordinate women or downplay their interests should be changed. Second claim is that the experiences of women are vital to a full and accurate understanding of morality. Their standpoint matters and should be taken into consideration when doing ethical theory. So to the extent that philosophers ignore these experiences, their theories are bound to be incomplete and are likely biased and inaccurate. The third central claim is that traits that have traditionally been associated with women are at least as morally important as traditionally masculine traits. So these traits might include care, empathy, partiality, sensitivity to concrete situations. So these traits are just as important as traits that are associated traditionally with men, such as maybe competitiveness, or strict adherence to rules and principles and things like that. And this relates to the fourth claim, which is that traditionally feminine ways of moral reasoning are often superior to traditional masculine ways of reasoning. So these ways of reasoning, again, are more of a sensitivity to the concrete situation and the particulars of each situation, and also an appeal to the moral importance of relationships. So here's a graph of traditional masculine and feminine modes of reasoning. Traditionally masculine ways of moral reasoning include being impartial, it can be highly abstract, it can involve a sort of strict adherence to rules, and traditional sort of feminine ways of moral reasoning include being more partial rather than impartial, such as partial relationships, more concreteness, more flexibility and openness. And these were actually identified by some studies by Carol Gilligan when she looked at the different ways in which men, women, and girls and boys reason. Now, additionally, traditionally associated masculine and feminine traits also come into the picture. So traditional masculine traits might be competitiveness, independence, demanding one's fair share, and fairness. Traditional feminine traits could be empathy and the dependence aspect of relationships, mercy. And the basic idea is that because ethics and philosophy have traditionally been done by men, these modes of reasoning and these traits were seen as sort of the legitimate way of doing ethics, and these traits that are traditionally associated with femininity were marginalized. And so part of the project of feminist ethics is to bring this feminine perspective into the process of doing philosophy and doing ethics. So a little background regarding ecofeminism and the feminist approach within environmental ethics. So the first thing to know is that ecofeminism and feminism in general is a family of views rather than a systematic theory. So this is the difference between feminist approaches and, say, a Kantian approach or utilitarian approaches. And what the ecofeminist does is apply models of feminist critique that you see within ethics and philosophy, apply these models to environmental ethics. So there are sort of three core ways that this has been done. One is to emphasize that standpoints matter, and that your theory and ethics can be influenced by the standpoint from which it is actually formulated. Another aspect is that the feminist approach challenges dichotomous ways of thinking in socially constructed dichotomies. It not only challenges the dichotomy itself, but the whole framework of thinking about things in terms of one versus something else, in terms of dichotomous thinking. The third point is that it emphasizes the moral role of relationships, emotion, and care. Now, it's important to note that sexism, patriarchy, and misogyny, they're not just merely things of the past. They still show up today. I think most of us know how they've shown up in the past. And today, especially with things like the Me Too movement, we're seeing how oppression of women and misogyny are still part of social practices within, for example, the business world and so on. Okay, so let's delve a little bit deeper into the logic of domination and dichotomous thinking. So this is a contribution that feminist ethics has given toward environmental ethics. So the logic of domination of women can be applied to the domination of nature. So what feminist ethics has looked at is how all the different ways in which men have dominated and oppressed women, especially ways that may seem just normal. So part of that project is to unveil these relationships of oppression that before had just seemed legitimate because they were so common. Now, when you apply that to environmental ethics, you see that the same sort of relationship you see between men and women within society, that domineering relationship or relationship of oppression, also shows up within the relationship of humans and nature. We regard nature as something to be dominated, to be oppressed, to be used. In a similar sense, you also see that within the history of gender relations. Now, another aspect of the logic of domination is that Western thought is dichotomous, where one category is understood as opposed and superior to another category. So we can take a look at this with this table here. So we have dichotomous and hierarchical thinking, and these are socially constructed dichotomies and associations. So that's important to note. These are not part of nature or the natural order of things. So on the left, you can see all these aspects that are associated with masculinity, and on the right, you can see all these aspects that are associated with femininity. And you can see how all these aspects on the left are, according to society and culture, generally seen as superior to all these aspects on the right. And this is something that feminist ethicists really explicate and investigate. So let's apply this to environmental ethics. One common approach in environmental ethics is to demarcate what is sort of in the scope of intrinsic value and what is out of the scope of intrinsic value. So one way of thinking about environmental ethics is that we are sort of broadening the scope of what is considered to have intrinsic value and direct moral considerability. So many years past, it was just sort of men who were seen as morally equal, and then men and women were brought into the scope as being seen as morally equal. Of course, it's more complicated than this. And then with environmental ethics and animal ethics, we start to bring animals within this scope of moral considerability, where animals are also seen as having inherent moral worth. And as we've seen, other theories even say that plants and ecosystems can fall within this scope. But the feminist approach criticizes this whole way of viewing the project of environmental ethics. To quote Sandler, Ronald Sandler, ecofeminism suggests that the problem is not only that too much is traditionally excluded from having moral worth and treated as a mere resource, but that the project of trying to clearly demarcate what is in and what is out is problematic. It's more complex than that, according to ecofeminist. So according to ecofeminism, environmental ethics needs to move beyond this way of conceptualizing how we should morally regard things. That is, we need to move beyond this idea that you're either in or out of the scope of moral considerability. Another aspect of ecofeminism is they stress relational accounts of value. So it moves beyond dichotomous conceptions of value and the idea that the properties of things ground their moral considerability. So rather than the property of individual things making them morally considerable, we need to look at the relationship a thing has to other things. So the relationship is morally relevant and may ground or at least inform how we ought to regard and treat those things. So relationships in themselves may have value. To quote Sandler again, value is often organic and interwoven such that it can't be broken up conceptually or practically into these distinct components attached to discrete organisms and entities. Rather, we need to look at the relationship between entities, and that's what's going to sort of reveal the nature of moral considerability and how we should regard these things. It's the relationships matter here. Okay, so another aspect of feminist ethics is the ethics of care. This is one approach within feminist ethics that we can apply within environmental philosophy. So, to quote Sandler, this emphasizes the role of such things as attachment, emotion, connection, partiality, trust, dependence, openness, and so on. And all these things are needed in order to engage well within ethical reasoning and with each other. To put it simply, care is crucial to morality and our moral engagements. And this is something that has been neglected in traditional ethics and ethical theory. I'll just give you a quick example. This example comes from a piece by Michael Stalker. So you can imagine, let's say your friend goes and visits their mom in the hospital, and this is the right thing to do. And you may ask your friend, well, why did you do this? Now let's say your friend is a Kantian, and he says, well, the moral reason I did this was because it was my duty to go visit my mom in the hospital. Or you could even think of, imagine they're a utilitarian, and they could say, well, the moral reason I did this was because I want to maximize overall happiness. Something seems wrong with this. Those reasons don't seem to be the right kind of reasons or the appropriate reasons for visiting your mom in the hospital. But they don't seem to be the right kind of moral reasons. Rather, the proper reason, motivating reason, is simply because you care about your mom. And the ethics of care is able to capture that appropriate motivational reason to do the right thing in this case. So for many environmental ethics or ethicists, care is important. And feminist philosophy, especially the ethics of care, can explain that. Care for the natural environment partly constitutes understanding the natural environment, according to many environmental ethicists. Care, for example, is able to engage us in the natural environment, and care can sort of open the natural environment up like an aperture in a camera that enables us to really understand it. And all that's important for an environmental ethic and important for us to properly regard the natural environment as something that's valuable. So the ethics of care has a lot to contribute to environmental ethics. Okay, so another aspect of feminist theory that we can apply to environmental ethics is the importance of diverse perspectives. According to this approach, a diversity of perspectives helps us understand the ethical issue better. Now, traditionally, moral theory has been done from one perspective, which is primarily the white privileged male perspective. And according to many feminists, this matters. The perspective from which theory is undertaken contributes to the content of that theory, and it also contributes to the issues that are deemed legitimate issues of investigation. So the problem with doing ethics from one perspective, whether that be a gender perspective or even socioeconomic perspective, is that it prevents a comprehensive understanding of morality. And we can apply this to environmental ethics. To quote Sandler, many ecofeminists emphasize that avoiding myopia or short-sightedness requires listening to the narratives, stories, and knowledge and perspectives of all affected people when trying to characterize and address ecological problems, especially those who are all too often marginalized or disempowered in social and political contexts. So if we're looking at an ethical issue, we need to look at the perspectives from everyone who is affected by that issue, especially those who do not have power and who are marginalized. A quick example of this would be Cancer Alley in the United States, where you have all these factories set up, and they produce waste that is highly carcinogenic, and hence the name Cancer Alley. Many people in these areas develop cancer, but you don't hear much from them because they are of very low economic status and they have very little power. So in order to look at this issue, we need to take up their perspective, listen to their narratives. Okay, so that does it for the short introduction of ecofeminism. Thanks for watching.